Hey everybody, today I'm going to discuss how we get to the end of the Civil War, how the war itself came to a conclusion in the spring of 1865, and then I'm going to move into a discussion of Reconstruction. I'm going to follow this up in a couple weeks with another lecture on Reconstruction, and obviously we're going to begin reading this week Eric Foner's work on Reconstruction, which gives you a really deep overview of what's happening in individual states in the South. But right now I just want to begin with the year 1864, the final full year of the Civil War. 1864 is probably, it's kind of hard to say this for sure because every year of the war is so crucial, but this is probably the most important year. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Ken Burns' Civil War documentary before. But he dedicates 2 of the 9 parts of that documentary just to this one year. It's a grueling year on the battlefield. It's a bellwether year politically, and it is the year that decides basically the fate of both of these armies. So from the 1st of May to the end of July, about 3 months, Grant's army is in Virginia, and they're grinding away at Lee's army, trying to sort of to pulverize them once and for all. The casualties, though, sustained by Grant's army, this is the Army of the Potomac, were 66,000 men. It's the largest loss of life in the shortest amount of time in American military history. The war in Virginia was one of stalemate. It's a war of attrition. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about how we get to that point, why things were so bad in the summer of 1864. Remember, this is a year after Gettysburg. Gettysburg is this major turning point. We read a primary source a few weeks ago from a Confederate soldier who's in the aftermath of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, these 2 major battles in the West and in the East, that the Union wins, thinking like, oh, it's all over. Well, now it's a year later and we're still grinding through these really brutal military campaigns. So why was that, and what did it actually achieve? Those are 2 big questions for right now. Let's talk about Grant first. He keeps coming up in the lectures. It's hard to ignore him when you talk about the battlefield, at least in the Civil War. And as I've noted in the last few lectures, Grant rose from anonymity, really, right? He's working in his brother's shop in Illinois, in a small town in Illinois. At the beginning of the war, he's basically, his military career is finished. And then he rises to become the most successful military figure in the Union Army within a couple of years. He has major victories at Shiloh, Vicksburg is the big one, Chickamauga. In March of 1864, because of these victories, Lincoln, who is a big fan of Grant's, appoints him Lieutenant General of the entire U.S. Army. Grant is the first person to ever hold this position. They essentially create a position specifically for Grant. He is the commander of the entire U.S. Army. And Grant takes into this position a strategy for victory that he shares with Lincoln. Lincoln agrees with him, as well as Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman, who are the 2 sort of other key generals in Grant's army. Here's the strategy. 1, capturing Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, doesn't matter. Remember, we had talked about George McClellan's strategy in the Peninsular Campaign. This is back in 1862, and he's got this big grand plan. I'm going to capture Richmond. But Grant recognizes that Confederate power isn't in the capital, right? The Confederate government can move anywhere it wants to. Capturing that city is as close to meaningless as basically any other goal in the war, aside from defeating the army, right? That's the thing that matters. Grant recognizes that the war is political. The Union needs to solidify political or public opinion at home. It needs to whip up morale. They need to get support, so they need to have victories on the battlefield. But also, and this is really crucial, It's political in another way. The Union has to crush Southern morale, okay? And that's going to mean making war not necessarily just on Southern armies, but on Southern people, on Southern resources, and on slavery. If you can completely destabilize Southern society, then you can erode Southern people's confidence in the Confederate war effort, the Confederate government, and you will kill the Confederacy from within. And that means, as well, intensifying this war on slavery, intensifying the attempt to emancipate the slaves, right? So this is a military strategy that works in conjunction with Lincoln's political strategy of emancipation. Grant's other strategy is to attack Lee head on and never ever pull back and retreat, never give Grant the chance to regroup. That's the war of attrition. It basically put your foot on the gas pedal and don't take it off until you've killed them. And just kill as many Confederates as possible. Grant recognizes, and Lincoln recognizes, that the cost of this strategy is going to be a huge, huge loss of life for the Union armies, which is how you end up with 66,000 casualties in 3 months. That's more than the Vietnam War in its entirety, and the largest loss of life in U.S. military history in the shortest amount of time. So Grant embarks on, in the summer of 1864, his overland campaign. Begins here about 80 miles to the west of Washington, D.C., and we have a succession of major battles as Grant sort of pushes Lee down south. Every time they have a battle, instead of retreating back to the north, Grant's going to continue forward, keep moving southeast, with the ultimate goal of getting between Grant and his supply lines, starving the army, and eventually ending it. First major battle of the overland campaign is the Wilderness, Battle of the Wilderness here, around Spotsylvania County, Virginia. That's in May of '64. This is a grueling and gruesome war. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of casualties that actually died because the woods caught fire and they burned to death. There are 18,000 casualties in Grant's army. Here are some of the human remains after the war. I'd imagine that these were posed, that a photographer came along, this is common in the Civil War era, to create a more dramatic rendering of the scene. They would move human remains in ways that would make for an interesting photograph and look sort of natural. But these are human skulls after the Battle of the Wilderness. So the 18,000 casualties for Grant, 11,000 for Lee. And Lee expects, and many members of enlisted men in Grant's army expect, that Grant's going to pull back and regroup. He doesn't. Instead, he keeps pressing into Virginia with the goal of just cutting Lee's supply line, just keep going forward, keep Lee on his heels. Almost immediately after the Wilderness, Lee's army entrenches at a crossroads called Spotsylvania Courthouse, which is just right here. So you can see it's just that next arrow down. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, and a lot of what comes out of the overland campaign, is like a rehearsal for the First World War. And if you know anything about World War I, you know there's trench warfare, right? These two armies embed themselves in trenches in the earth, and it's just sort of stalemate, firing at one another. This is what the armies begin to do. This is what happens at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The Confederates get there just before Grant's army is able to, and they build these earthworks and they entrench. Grant's army, true to form in this year of 1864, they push forward, they march right at those trenches. There's 30,000 casualties for Grant's army, a stunningly high casualty rate, 20,000 for Lee. Again, Grant keeps moving. There's a brief battle called the Battle of North Anna, and then we get to Cold Harbor in early June. So this is North Anna right here, Cold Harbor down here. We're getting close. This is sort of on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. So they're very close to the capital. But again, it's not necessarily the capital that matters, it's the supply line. Cold Harbor, Grant in his memoirs, which is probably the most, Grant's memoirs might be the most famous piece of presidential writing besides like Lincoln's speeches. They're this a brilliant rendering of his life and his times in the Civil War, as well as president, as the 18th president of the United States. But in the memoir, Grant writes that Cold Harbor was his only real regret of the war. Basically what he did, this is the largest frontal attack of the war. Grant just takes 50,000 Union troops and tries to move them forward all at once and just completely overwhelm Confederate defenses. The Confederates are dug in. They're not able to be moved. And in a half an hour, Grant's army sustained 7,000 casualties. The men knew this was going to be the strategy. The Union soldiers, they knew this was going to be the strategy, and they knew they were going to die. Right? This is essentially a suicide mission with the attempt to destabilize the Confederate defenses. Drew Faust writes about this. In the book, we read a bit about this. Union soldiers before Cold Harbor pinned their names, their family names, their addresses to the uniforms. They didn't have dog tags, as we read, in anticipation that they would be killed and that someone would have to let their families know. One soldier, the morning of the battle, this is sort of heartbreaking, wrote in his diary, morning, June 3rd, I died today at Cold Harbor. And he did die. And this is the battle. What this meant was that Grant had to slow down. The casualty rate was too high, but it did not mean he would stop. Right? What we're seeing here, if you think back a couple weeks, in one of my lectures, I talked about what advantages the Union had over the Confederacy, and there's a lot of them. There's the industrial production, there's the supplies, there's the money and the wealth, and there's a population. There's so many more people who live in the North. And Grant just has superior numbers. He recognizes he can continue being so aggressive and he can sustain these casualties because there are going to be men to fill the ranks, and there's going to be men who are just going to be put into the meat grinder of the overland campaign. And so he doesn't have to stop after Cold Harbor. He slows down for a minute, but he doesn't have to stop, and he can continue forward. And he gets to the city of Petersburg. Let's go back to the map for a second, which is actually south of Richmond. So he swings kind of far east and then down south. And they put the city of Petersburg under siege. So now we're in June of '64. So this is about 2 months into the overland campaign. The siege is going on for about a month. It's difficult. I don't think I have a picture. I don't have a picture yet of the Confederate earthworks, their trenches, that they're defending themselves and they're defending the city of Petersburg with, but it's very difficult to uproot them, to move them. And so the Union forces adopt a kind of desperate strategy. There's some coal miners from Pennsylvania who say to their commanding officer, who then moves this message along to Grant, hey, we can dig a tunnel under the Confederate line and then put dynamite in there and blow them up from underneath the ground, right? These are coal miners from Western Pennsylvania. These guys are experts at this sort of work. And so they do. I've got a couple of images here. Here's a rendering of these guys, coal miner troops, digging the tunnel. There's the entrance to the tunnel. It still exists. It's just outside of Petersburg. Here's a rendering of the tunnel itself. And they stuff it with 4 tons of dynamite, and on July 30th, 1864, they blow it up. If you've ever seen the movie Cold Mountain, with Jude Law and Nicole Kidman, it's maybe 10 15-year-old movie. It's pretty good. This is the beginning scene of the film. They blow up the Confederate defenses. Men are literally just shot through the air. It eviscerates the Confederate line, but then this happens, this horrible situation. True to form, for 1864, the Union troops rush forward. This is what they've been doing all summer. We're going to rush forward, frontal assault, frontal assault. They end up running into the crater in the ground that's been created by this explosion. And the Confederates have time to regroup, and they begin just picking Union soldiers off who are inside the crater. And they kill 4,000 Union troops there. So the Battle of the Crater is what this event is called, July 30th. It's a failure for the Union. It's a pretty stunning and embarrassing defeat. But all it really means is that the Union troops pull back and they just continue their siege of the city of Petersburg, which is going to last all the way until April of 1865. So Petersburg is under siege for about 10 months, basically until the entire war ends. Here are the Union trenches, Union defenses outside of Petersburg. So again, it gives you a sense of just how similar this is to the Western Front in the First World War. Okay. You can imagine the situation at home in the North as this is happening, right? People are horrified, they're disgusted. You have small towns in New England, small towns in the Midwest. There might be 500 people in the town, 1,000 people in the town, and they're getting noticed that there's half a dozen or a dozen of their young men killed in a single battle in Virginia, right? It's a strategy that asks a lot of the northern people. There's a growing desperation in July and August of 1864 to just put this to a stop, to just end the war one way or another, to make it happen. In short, northern morale is very fragile. The overland campaign is not the only thing happening in the war in 1864. There's also very significant developments further south and to the west. So let's talk about this guy for a second. This is William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman is the second most powerful military figure in the Union at the time. He's in command of the Army of Tennessee, and they are embarking on what becomes known as the Atlanta Campaign. And this is around the same time that the overland campaign is happening in Virginia. In June, Sherman weakens the Confederate defenses of the city of Atlanta at Kennesaw Mountain. And then he, just as the Army of the Potomac with Grant is putting Petersburg under siege, they put Atlanta under siege, and Atlanta falls in September of 1864. Atlanta is the most important city in the Deep South. It's the most important city outside of Virginia that hadn't already fallen to the Union. So this is a huge strategic and military turning point. This is a major moment in the war. But then Sherman has a decision to make. What's he going to do? Is he going to try to hold tight in the city of Atlanta and keep his eye on Tennessee, where he had come from, and try and prevent Confederates from retaking Tennessee? What's he going to do? What he decides to do, sort of brashly, is, and this map is not the best, but it'll do, is he decides to march down to Savannah. It's 285 miles out on the coast. Georgia's pretty big, actually. So here you see Atlanta up in, I'm pointing at it with my pen as if you can see it, but you can't. Here you see Atlanta. Sherman's going to move his army all the way down to Savannah. We'll talk about these other movements here in just a second. The most important one you need to know for the year of 1864 is his move to the south and to the east towards Savannah. This is obviously Sherman's march to the sea. Probably the most famous campaign, single campaign of the whole war. And it's going to last from November 15th to December 24th to Christmas Eve. It's about 5 weeks. And Sherman's strategy, this is something I was mentioning just before, is we're not necessarily going to worry about Confederate power where it rests, right, or where it's most obviously concentrated, and instead we're going to make war on the Confederate people. We're going to make war on the land. We're going to make war on the resources. We are going to break the backs of the Confederacy as a society, right? We are going to end it as a society, and we are not going to allow the people to continue their way of life. Here's what he writes. We are not fighting a hostile army anymore. We are fighting a hostile people. So he turns his attention to the people. He promises, this is probably his most famous quote of his entire life, to make Georgia howl, right? There's a similar strategy further north in Virginia. Philip Sheridan, this is to the west of the Overland Campaign, General Philip Sheridan, who is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And he writes of his strategy, my plan is to leave them only their eyes with which to weep, right? So this is decimation of the food supply, destruction of slavery, destruction of property, and leave them nothing left. There's nothing, you can't call it a society anymore because there is no material foundation to it. This has been coming for some time, right? Sherman is certainly the most famous face of this strategy, but it's been coming for a while. You'll remember back when I talked about the Battle of Shiloh, Grant recollected after that battle that the war would have to be one of total conquest, right? There wasn't going to be a situation where you had a few more battlefield victories, but then you were able to coax the southern states back into the Union and work out some kind of political agreement and go back to the way things were. That was just not going to happen. You had to absolutely eviscerate the enemy, and there couldn't really be any middle ground. So the war goes to the people, and the strategy is conquest, not only of the armies, but of the people. So Sherman's army, they're marching for these 5 weeks down to Savannah, and they're like a magnet for enslaved people. As many as 25,000 freed people tagged along, right? They escaped slavery. He's moving through a really, really critical heartland of the slave society of the South. And so enslaved people are just leaving their masters en masse, and they're following along. This is their only hope, right? There's not really much other hope this deep South other than to attach yourself to Union forces. Sherman was hostile to these people. Sherman was a racist. He didn't care much about the issue of slavery. He was a military man. He wanted to win the war. That was really all he cared about. He was no humanitarian, that's for sure. There were moments along the march where his troops were directly responsible for the deaths of freed people who were following along. I strongly recommend, especially if you're on quarantine with the virus over the next few weeks, if you can get a hold of, there's a novel called The March by a guy named E.L. Doctorow. And it's historical fiction. I think he published it in 2005 or 2006. But it's an amazing book. And it adopts the perspective of lots of different figures participating in this march, including many freed people, but also Sherman himself, young enlisted men, Confederate soldiers who dress up as Union soldiers to try and join up and save their own skin. Just what a weird sort of assemblage of human life the march was as it made its way to Savannah. Gets to Savannah, so that's just a little recommendation. Check it out. It's a great book. He gets to Savannah on Christmas Eve. The city falls with essentially no opposition. And from there, he wires Abraham Lincoln one of the other most famous messages of the war. So he says, I'm going to make Georgia howl. And then he sends this to Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Here's a good rendering of the march that captures some of what I was talking about in that novel by E.L. Doctorow. You see all the diversity of people who are along for the ride. And look at the work of the soldiers. They're hacking down telegraph lines. They're burning property. They're destroying the railroad. They're seizing other property. So you have like booty down here in the bottom left. There's horses just sort of assembled in all different directions. This is a dramatic, but I think powerful and to some extent accurate depiction of what was going on in Sherman's march. So from Savannah, he didn't stop. You know, we always call it Sherman's March to the Sea, but it was actually much longer than that, and it continued well into the spring of '65. From Savannah, they moved north into the heart of secession territory. Sherman has very little tolerance for South Carolinians. He wants to make them suffer badly for causing the war. So he burns the city of Columbia to the ground. Columbia is the capital of South Carolina. There it is. The entire city is laid waste. There's, oh, I thought I had another image of it, but I guess I only have that one. And then from Columbia moves actually pretty far east towards Goldsboro, North Carolina, and then finally ends at the capital of North Carolina, Raleigh, as the war is ending. Okay, there's something to keep in mind. So these are huge, huge military developments. I grew up in a town in New England with a number of different Civil War monuments, like every single town in New England. And it lists, the monument in our town has the names of the battles where soldiers died. And I think there's like one guy was killed at Bull Run, and 2 or 3 had been killed at Gettysburg, and then the rest are all from 1864. Cold Harbor, Wilderness. I don't think anyone at the Crater, but this is, as I said before, it's the meat grinder of the Civil War. But in the midst of this, right, some of the most famous developments of the entire war, there's a presidential election happening. 1864 is an election year, just like 2020 is. It's pretty hard to imagine, like, isn't it exhausting enough just to run a presidential election when you're not in the middle of a civil war? But they run the election anyway. There is no stopping it. And it would not be an easy re-election campaign for Lincoln, right? He was going to have to actually struggle, and he was pretty sure as late as August and even into September that he would not be re-elected. He was very worried about this. Sherman's winning Atlanta helped, but he was concerned, and it didn't necessarily look good, right? What's he fighting against? Those mounting casualties all through the summer of '64, that's very hard to bring to the voters and ask for support. There's a military draft. It's not vast. It's not necessarily touching everybody's life just because so many people had volunteered. But the draft is not necessarily popular, and there's a lot of opposition to it, especially in Democratic regions like New York City. There's a party, the Democrats, who are very active. They're very vehemently opposed to Lincoln's policies, and they run a peace platform. And to some extent, they run a unionist platform. They think that they can stitch the Union back together with new terms of peace and stop emancipation. And even the Republican Party is saying, should we keep Lincoln? There are major figures in the Republican Party who think dumping Lincoln, even in the spring of 1864, is going to be the safest bet. So he's not sure he's going to win. The Democrats, as Lincoln's opponent, nominate this guy who I've talked about a few times already, George McClellan. George McClellan had been the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac earlier in the war. He's the one who Lincoln could not stand because McClellan would always pull back. It was the opposite of what Grant does in the Overland Campaign. For fear of sustaining any casualty, he would refuse to engage in battle that he should have engaged in. When he defeated an enemy, he would tend to pull back rather than pursue them and defeat them once and for all. McClellan comes back. He is the Democrats' candidate. Remember, McClellan also, I said this, was pro-slavery. It wasn't that he was anti-abolition. He was just pro-slavery. He wanted nothing to do with the emancipation of any enslaved people. He wanted to protect slave property. And so he's a good fit for the Democratic Party in that way too, because the Democrats have a lot of pro-slavery members still. This is a racist election. This is classic racist politics of the 1860s here, but we see the Democratic platform is for the white man, and the Republican platform is not, right? That's what they're saying, and this is the McClellan strategy in '64. But the problem with the Democrats' approach was that they needed the war to go badly. They would do well if Union forces did poorly. But the victories throughout the summer and fall, even though Grant isn't able to pry Lee's men out of Petersburg, he's still able to hold them in submission, right? He's starving them out. It's going to take a while, but people understand that he's in a position of strength. And Sherman's victories in the South are just propelling Lincoln towards re-election, and he does secure re-election, of course. Okay. One thing, actually, before I talk about surrender, I want to talk about one other political development. The 13th Amendment, which happens in the midst of all of this. Petersburg is still under siege. This is January of '65. Lincoln has not yet been inaugurated for his second term yet. That would come in March, but he's been reelected. Sherman is doing his thing in South Carolina. And Congress is debating the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, if you don't know, bars involuntary servitude. It ends slavery formally once and for all. And it's very easy, I think, to look back at the Civil War and say, well, it's very neat and tidy. One side won, the other side lost, so they created a law that basically shows that one side won by ending slavery. It makes sense, right? It's a very sort of Hollywood ending to the story, and in fact, this is the subject of the film Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg film from about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago with Daniel Day-Lewis. But it actually wasn't a sure thing. And say what you want about that movie, I think one of the good things it shows is that it wasn't a sure thing. In fact, passing an amendment to the Constitution that ended slavery was sort of a remarkable accomplishment. It was a completely remarkable accomplishment if you look at the long stretch of American history, but even in this moment at the end of the war, there's no sure thing. Lincoln knew it had to happen. He's focusing on it pretty obsessively after his reelection because he feared that as soon as the war ended, the Emancipation Proclamation would be declared invalid, that Southerners would come back into national life, they would just go to the courts, they would sue for their property rights, and under the existing laws of the country in 1860, the courts would find in their favor and enslaved people would just be brought back in slavery. And where would you be then? You'd be back in the 1850s. Exactly the situation that we have under the fugitive slave law in the 1850s is going to just be playing out again. This is keeping Lincoln up at night. It's keeping a lot of people up at night. And so it's very necessary to literally change the Constitution. That's the only safeguard, or else the courts could side with Southerners. The other concern that Lincoln has is there's a lot of enslaved people who were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation, at least not directly affected. And those are the people in the border states. because those states weren't at war with the United States, enslaved people there remained property of their owners, who technically remained loyal to the United States. Lincoln wants to abolish slavery everywhere. This is the chance. This is really the only chance. The 13th Amendment passes the House of Representatives by 2 votes, just 2 votes, in January of 1865. And so the war, and then the war ends in its most formal iteration 2 months later. The 13th Amendment is ratified in December of that year. Okay, let's talk about the formal end of the war now. Grant breaks the defenses at Petersburg. After 10 months of siege, Lee's supply line is cut, his army is doomed, and the Union Army is in control of Richmond. Richmond falls on April 5th. Lee's soldiers are deserting en masse. We've seen this in some of the primary sources. Desertion becomes a huge existential problem for the Confederate Army in the last year of the war. But for a brief moment, again, it all seems odd. Of course, the 2 armies would meet at Appomattox Courthouse. You'd have a 13th Amendment barring slavery forever. The 2 armies would meet. These 2 guys would shake hands, and it would all sort of end. But it didn't actually have to happen that way, and there's various moments where that wasn't going to be the outcome. Lee, for a number of weeks, has a strategy to head south, to break away, to continue escaping Grant's offensive onslaughts, and to actually meet up with, there's this other great Confederate army in North Carolina that's under the command of Joseph E. Johnston. And if he can combine those 2 armies, it's going to be a lot of work for the Union to continue fighting them. So he heads west. There's a short battle at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And Lee's just unable to continue that strategy of moving south. Too many men have deserted. His army has essentially vanished, and Grant has effectively cut off the supply lines once and for all. So his army is starving and shrinking. And so he surrenders April 9th, 1865. And that's that. So Grant's army simply lets Confederate soldiers go home. They allow them to keep their sidearms, right? They have to turn over their rifles. And that's it. They send them home. They technically put Lee under house arrest, but they never end up charging him with anything. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president, respectively, they are going to be charged with various crimes, including treason, but they are never tried. And the war, at least in its most formal sense, ends. Now, there's historians who would argue that we don't consider the end of a war in the 20th and 21st centuries. We really don't consider the end of a war the moment when 2 powerful figures shake hands, right? We have to think about the ways that wars can linger, and the ways that small bands of militias can continue to wage war and continue to disrupt society. Certainly, we've learned that lesson in a number of small wars and not so small wars here in the US throughout the 20th and the 21st centuries. But at least in its formal sense, as a war between the Confederate government, which says that it exists, and the Union, and the Confederacy's attempt to establish a new nation, that ends here in April of '65. Thousands of ex-Confederates have to get out of Dodge. Leading planters, leading secessionists, right, the people who really made this war happen, many of them flee the country. They go to Brazil, which is now the world's largest slave society, that the Confederacy is dead. They go to England, they go to Mexico, they go to the Caribbean. Some try to maintain slavery where they go. Others just don't want to be executed. Although there wasn't really much of a reason to fear that, although they didn't know that at the time. Anyway, 6 days after Appomattox, 6 days, right, same week, John Wilkes Booth murders Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. This is Good Friday, the same day that Christ was crucified, which lends to Abraham Lincoln's sort of Christ-like place in American history. The man who gave his life to end slavery or something like that, right? There was 6 days of total jubilation in the North following Appomattox, and that abruptly ends with Lincoln's assassination. One Northern diarist called this the darkest day I ever remember. Every house, wrote another, shows something to symbolize deep grief. We read about this in Faust, right? Lincoln's death is symbolic of all of the war's death. It seems to encapsulate all of the suffering, all of the weariness, all of the exhaustion, all of the sadness, the grief. Even Confederates, and many Confederates celebrate this death jubilantly, even if it's only in their diary because they're afraid to do it in public because they'll be murdered by Union troops or something like that. But there are many Confederates who fear the consequences of the assassination. Mary Chestnut is probably the most famous diarist of the Civil War. She's in South Carolina. She writes, "This foul murder will bring down worse miseries on us." Okay, so they fear that Lincoln's execution will simply make things harder and the retribution will be stronger. Okay, so we've ended the war to some extent. Amid all of this grief in the South for the Confederacy's demise, grief in the North for all that's been lost, but especially here in April of '65 for Lincoln's death, there's all of these other big questions looming, right? When you look at a picture like this, you get a sense of a thing ended, right? What could symbolize that more than a handshake? The deal is done. But that is actually not the case at all in '65. In fact, all that's been decided is which army has vanquished the other. Now we have to turn back to the world of politics, and the political questions, they bubble up immediately, and they are vast and they are diverse. What's going to come next? What's going to become of these millions of freed people? Slavery is dead, but now what? Right? And that's a question that's been on people's minds for a couple of years as Union emancipation has sort of unfolded. But now there's simply no escaping that question. What's going to happen to all of these formerly belligerent Southerners, right? Are we just going to shake hands and send them home, really? Or could something else happen? How will all of these former states, what will happen to them? Are they even states anymore? What is their place in the United States of America? What is their relationship to the United States of America? Are they part of it or not? And if they are part of it, what are the conditions of that relationship? How basically do you reconcile? Or do you reconcile? Is that even on the table? What will become of the millions of Union veterans who just fought this war and whose lives were unalterably changed by the war? What about trends we see leading up to the war? What will happen with these things? Industrialization, Western expansion, that most important question. Conflicts with Native Americans. What's going to happen in all of these places? The war solves one question and it exposes thousands of others, right? Thousands of big existential questions, some of which Americans are going to struggle with for the rest of the 19th century. Questions that will completely define American politics for a generation. And some of which we've never fully answered. Some of the questions that are on the table in 1865 are the essential questions of American public life still today. The most central question, though, if you could sum it all up in one big way, as the historian David Blight has, the major question would be this: will Reconstruction be the revival of something old, or will it be the creation of something new? Right? What does that mean? Revival of something old, meaning, will this be a return to the status quo, or will this be a radical, revolutionary departure? Will the United States be stitched back together, or will the United States be reborn? Is this a second founding of the United States? We're going to talk about this for the next few weeks. This entire period from 65, really even from the middle of the war to the end of the 1870s, is known as Reconstruction. I'm just going to put my cards on the table here and tell you this is the most overlooked important moment in American history. Overlooking Reconstruction is an enormous mistake. I think to the extent that Americans don't necessarily understand their own history or why certain issues are important politically, it is because they have not learned Reconstruction. They've learned this, right? They've learned there was one side, there's another side, they fought, they got together, they agreed it was over, and everybody went back to life. That is not at all what happened. The country that we live in really is founded in these years, between 1865 and 1867. This big blank spot on the map of most Americans' historical imagination is actually the founding of the modern United States. So let's talk basics. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, Foner is going to give you a really good sense of life on the ground in the South during Reconstruction. And the primary sources next week are going to give you some more of this, and then we're going to have 2 more weeks after that to talk about it. What I want to talk about here is just a quick basic outline of how different groups of people imagined Reconstruction, what it could be, and then what some of the major touchstones were of Reconstruction policy, just so that you're kind of literate with the big pictures on the table. So, Lincoln had a plan for Reconstruction. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. His plan was to make it fast. Let's do it quick. Lenient and generous. Okay, he doesn't want to punish. He doesn't want to linger on the war. And he wants it to be under his authority. He wants the presidency to be the branch of the federal government, the executive, to be completely in control. So to that end, he fashions a plan called the 10% plan, which would readmit Southern states to the Union after 10% of their white population took a loyalty oath and fashioned a new constitution that banned slavery. He doesn't want to hang Confederates. He doesn't really want any retribution. He wants, as much as possible, to bring the Union back together simply without slavery. Okay, so this is like the minimal change approach, except for that one crucial change that he will not negotiate on. So these governments that are created from 10% of the loyal white population, they're called Lincoln governments, and 3 of them were actually founded in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas at the end of the war. Lincoln's theory here is basically the government of the state is whatever we say the government of the state is, right? So if you can get 10% of the white people of the state to convene a government anywhere, it doesn't have to be in the capital, it can be anywhere, and then say, yeah, we're the state, the federal government can agree with them and bring them back into the Union. So he wants to avoid, he's cautious, he's pragmatic, he wants to avoid as much political animosity as possible. Okay, but Lincoln obviously isn't around to see this through. Congress has a different approach. Congress is a little bit more radical. The Republican Party in Congress is led, obviously it's Lincoln's party, but it's led by people who have different visions of Reconstruction. One of those men here on the left is Thaddeus Stevens. If you saw Steven Spielberg's Lincoln movie, he's played by Tommy Lee Jones. He has a very prominent role in the movie. Congressman from Pennsylvania. And then Charles Sumner, who we've talked about before. This is him on the right, abolitionist, radical abolitionist from Massachusetts. Sumner is the man who had been beaten nearly to death by Preston Brooks on the floor of the Senate in an event that sort of sparked Bleeding Kansas back in the 1850s. He has recovered by 1865, and he really is a sort of lion of the Senate. So Lincoln wanted fast, lenient, generous. These guys, their plan is for Reconstruction to be harsh towards Southern whites, to be long and slow, right? They want to make sure that they assure Union dominance and Union power over the South. And they want it under Congress's control, not the president's. They see Reconstruction as a chance to start over. They see Reconstruction as a chance to forever rectify the founding flaws of the United States, to create a more democratic, a more just, more equitable society. So they don't just want 10% of the white population to get together, smack a government together, slap a government together, I guess, and get going, right? They want a lot more than that. Stevens wants secessionist states to be reverted to their territorial status. So they would basically be like foreign nations that had been conquered, not like fellow states that were simply coming back after a bad fight. And that would mean that Washington would have complete government control over those territories. Sumner, his argument was that the South had committed political suicide. So that meant the states had ceased to exist. There was no such thing as Alabama. There's no such thing as Georgia. Those are gone now. They had committed suicide. And so new governments have to be completely reorganized. And to do that, because a place that has no government has no autonomy and no independence, they have to be completely dependent on Congress. And a lot of this has to do with preventing the old planter elite who had sparked secession, who had led the war, from coming back to power. Because a lot of them have fled the country, but they haven't totally disappeared. And this is a great fear among radical Republicans like these guys. So they also bar any officer or political leader of the Confederacy from regaining citizenship. Okay, these are the sorts of things that they're trying to do. There's a third party here to consider. Lincoln did not live to see these political battles fought. In his place was a Democrat, a former slaveholder, but also a Unionist, a deeply vain, insecure, paranoid man named Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a states' rights white supremacist to the bone, like many Democrats of the era. We've already seen in our reading of the Edisto Islanders correspondence with him that Johnson was hostile to freed people's claims to land. He was hostile to the idea of freed people's freedom generally. He believed the U.S. should be, as he put it, a white man's country forever. And his slogan in Reconstruction was this: the Constitution as it is, and the Union as it was. He accepts the 13th Amendment, right? There's no going back. That's done before he really assumes power. It's ratified in his first year in office. But he's not going to accept any further change. He's not going to accept any attempts by Republicans to protect freed people's civil rights. And this image sort of captures exactly this philosophy, right? Here's Andrew Johnson kicking this chest of drawers with the word freedmen on it right out. of the house of government. Um, and freed people themselves are scattered everywhere. Um, Johnson, for all his harshness towards freed people, was amazingly lenient towards secessionists. He allowed Southern states to form new governments with no loyalty oaths. Right, so forget the radical Reconstructionists' plan of starting from scratch. Heck, forget even the 10% plan of Lincoln. He allows the secessionists themselves to organize their governments. You don't have to prove that you were loyal. Anyone can join. The only demand he puts on them is that they nullify their acts of secession. So they have to basically say, we never seceded, and that's about it. These were white-only governments, and by the fall of 1865, this is 4 months after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, we have secessionists back in power in the South, and they begin passing so-called black codes. And I've kind of outlined here how different black codes worked for you. The main point here is that these essentially barred freed people from appearing in public without a written pass. So freed people were no longer free. They weren't necessarily owned by a white slave owner, but they were barred from any freedom of movement, which meant they couldn't go and hire themselves out. They couldn't apply for jobs. They couldn't move if they didn't like a situation. And so this is a reinstatement of key aspects of slave society. We also see in 65 and 66, outrageous acts of violence, insurgent violence against freed people all through the South. And again, I've outlined a few here in Shreveport, Louisiana. There's the murder of approximately 2,000 African Americans. Pine Bluff, Arkansas. There is a massacre of about 25 people and the burning of a Black community. Most famously, most well-known, there's the Memphis Massacre, and then the New Orleans Massacre, in which the city's white police massacred freed people who were attempting to achieve some political rights. These are both in 1866. So these are outrages. There are outrages in the North. Even though there's a great deal of white supremacy in the North, there's also a feeling that this is the old secessionists attempting to come back to power. And the war, the wounds of the war, the grief of the war is still really fresh. So there is widespread outrage about these things. And what we have in 66 is we have the makings of this great conflict. Radical Republicans are still in Congress, and they've got a lot of power. Johnson has to try and defend these kinds of outrages, as well as defend his leniency towards secessionists. And it's going to lead to the first impeachment in American history. Johnson's impeached in 1868. But he was really sidelined before that. You see back here in this image, you see at the top of this cartoon, it says the veto. Johnson used more vetoes than any other president in the 19th century. It was his only way to stop Republicans, or try to stop Republicans from passing laws that protected freed people. And they would override them. So after 66, with Republicans well in control of both houses of Congress, they're able to override his veto. And then we're in the era of congressional Reconstruction. And this is the big stuff. These are the most important moments in Reconstruction. So I'm just going to run through them quickly just to give you a kind of highlights. In 1865, Congress had created the Freedmen's Bureau. Its official name was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It's a national social welfare agency. There had never been anything like this in American history. It's dedicated primarily to aiding displaced people, right? It's essentially a refugee resettlement agency. We have many of these in the United States today. And that's its primary goal. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees at the end of the Civil War, displaced people. Um, Not just formerly enslaved people either. Many of them are Southern whites. And so the Freedmen's Bureau's job is to provide food, to provide medicine, in many cases to provide education for Black and white refugees in the South. It's also charged with protecting freed people's civil rights, such as they were. And we've seen some of this in our primary source reading. And we've also seen some condescension on the part of the Freedmen's Bureau. But by and large, the people who work for the Freedmen's Bureau, the agents, are pretty committed former Union soldiers and abolitionists. Okay, so this is unlike anything that's ever existed in American history to this point. Um, and they have this other job, almost impossible, of trying to decide what to do with confiscated and abandoned land. And there's a ton of that all through the South at the end of the war as planters have abandoned their lands, um, or their families' land has been confiscated by the Union Army. Um, so created in March of 65, crucially renewed in 66. That renewal is what gives the Freedmen's Bureau life into the early 1870s when it eventually did collapse. I'm going to talk about that in the next lecture. But renewed in 66 over Johnson's veto. Then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a model of civil rights legislation that remains really valuable in American life. Passed in April. This is an obvious response to the Black Codes. It defines the rights of citizenship. I think we probably all take that for granted, right? We all have a pretty clear-cut sense of what the rights of citizenship in the United States are. It had never been done. This is the first time that had ever been done in American history. What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States was not necessarily a widespread, significant question. It was sort of taken for granted prior to the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 changes that. And it is a signal that the citizens of the United States are just that. They are not necessarily citizens of Massachusetts, citizens of Connecticut, citizens of Virginia, whatever that is. They are instead citizens of the United States, which means they have rights that are guaranteed under the United States Constitution, which means that the federal government theoretically has a role in protecting those rights, even for people who are in the states, right? In other words, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 activates the federal government to protect American citizenship wherever it exists in the states. It is a statement that the federal government is the supreme power of the land. That is radical. We take it for granted, but that is radical in the 1860s. It has its limits. It barred public acts of discrimination, right? So the Civil Rights Act says that a state, for example, can't prevent you from collecting your wages that are due to you, or a state can't hold you without just cause, or a state can't prevent you from voting. But it doesn't prevent private acts of discrimination, right? So a white business owner doesn't have to serve a Black patron, for example. Congress does deal with that in the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is a short-lived but even more radical piece of legislation. The Supreme Court overturned it in the 1880s. Okay, Civil Rights Act of 1866. Johnson vetoes that as well. Republicans easily override those. That gets us to the big one. The most important legal outcome of the Civil War with the 13th Amendment is the 14th Amendment. If you don't know, if you're not clear on what the 14th Amendment is or what role it might play in your life, do some quick reading. Go you could check out articles about it in Smithsonian Magazine, some sources like that that are easy to find and kind of fun to read. This is as important as it gets in American law. The 14th Amendment has 5 parts. The first one is the one that radically transforms the relationship between citizens and the government. Again, this is kind of similar to the relationship of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, right? You pass this radical law, then you worry about what the courts will say, so you have to change the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, to some extent, is doing the same thing with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, right? Um, but basically what this does is it guarantees that Reconstruction, whatever its flaws, whatever its shortcomings, its failures, is going to be a revolutionary moment in American history. One historian has claimed about 2/3 of all court cases in the United States since have, in some way or another, dealt with rights granted under the 14th Amendment. 2/3. It is the center of American legal life. It enshrines birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. This has not historically been a controversial idea ever since, right? It's a radical idea in the 1860s. It's become somewhat controversial, I guess, in the past couple of years, which is somewhat surprising. It repudiated Confederate debts. Any debt that the Confederacy accumulated during the war effort, the United States would never pay. And this is the radical part, the most radical part. It guarantees equal protection of the law for all citizens. This is the most sweeping of all the law's rights. All citizens of the United States have equal protection under the law. The law must treat everybody the same. This is the radical egalitarianism of the Republicans in the 1860s. And this becomes really the basis of the civil rights movement in the 20th century, as well as basically every other rights claim that exists, right? The anti-abortion and the pro-abortion movements today, what do they call themselves? Pro-choice and pro-life movements, sorry about that, today, they both make 14th Amendment arguments about equal protection under the law. Corporations and workers both make equal rights arguments. And of course, the civil rights movement is entirely based on these ideas of equal protection under the law that the Jim Crow state did not grant and thus was in violation of the 14th Amendment. It's really at the heart of every major political movement in the 20th century. The authors of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 are probably people you haven't heard of before, and like John Bingham from Ohio, Lyman Trumbull from Illinois. These are radical Republicans who wrote these laws and amendments. They were trying to nationalize the Bill of Rights. What they're saying is those 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, those apply to every American every single day. And states cannot intervene, cannot interfere in those rights. Again, something you probably take for granted. Probably think, well, the Constitution applies to me every day. That is not the case in earlier American history, and that's a radical change. And it dramatically reshapes the idea of liberty in America ever after, at least theoretically. That doesn't mean that states aren't going to try to challenge this and often be successful. It doesn't mean that individuals aren't going to try and challenge it and be successful. And I'm going to talk about that in my next lecture about Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867. This is a bit more technical, it's a bit more on the ground. The legacy of this is not as enormous as the 14th Amendment, but forget the 10% plan, forget Johnson's readmission with no loyalty oaths. This is how states are going to be readmitted. Congress passes this in 1867. It dissolves the Southern governments that were formed under presidential Reconstruction. So all those governments that were trying to rebuild themselves while Johnson was still in power, this dissolves them. Those are not governments. It establishes 5 military districts. Sorry about that. Here's some good 14th Amendment pictures. It establishes 5 military districts throughout the South. So these are not states anymore, right? These are districts under the occupation of the United States military. This is something more akin to what we see or have seen in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 20 years. Each state has to assemble a biracial coalition, write a new constitution, ratify the 14th Amendment, and then apply for admission back into the United States. Andrew Johnson vetoes the Reconstruction Acts, and Congress overrides the veto. So this is the path that the former states are going to have to take if they want to rejoin the Union, and most of them will complete this by the 1870s. And then the story gets darker from there, and I'm going to give you more about that, and Foner gives you a little bit about that as well, but I'll save most of that for my next lecture. Quick note, 15th Amendment, there's one more major Reconstruction Amendment. The 14th Amendment left it up to states to protect the right to vote. The 15th Amendment builds upon that by guaranteeing all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. This is actually the most controversial, I would say, of all three Reconstruction Amendments, because what it did is it affected life in the North pretty profoundly. Black men did not have the right to vote in, say, Connecticut at the time of the Civil War, and white people in Connecticut did not want that to happen. So the 15th Amendment is a pretty direct challenge to life in the North, but it was passed in 1869, just before Ulysses S. Grant takes office as the president, and essentially what it does is it guarantees black men the right to vote. It does not say anything about women's right to vote, however. None of this solves everything. These are revolutionary changes, but there are enormous challenges on the ground. As some of those states are readmitted to the Union, the Democratic Party is able to seize control pretty quickly, and we see white supremacists come back to power throughout the 1870s in a long process. It's called redemption. Again, I'll have more about that next time. And Foner gives us a little bit about this story here, but the Ku Klux Klan is born in 1866. It's essentially a paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, with the goal of murdering freed people, but also murdering any white figures who support freed people or seem to support the Republican Party. I do want to give you two quick terms, and then I'm going to be done here. They come up in Foner, but he doesn't necessarily explain. He kind of takes for granted these terms, but they're weird terms, and maybe you've heard them before, maybe not. One is carpetbagger. That's a classic Reconstruction term. A carpetbagger is a slur, essentially, for a northern white who moves to the South after the Civil War with the goal of partaking in the Reconstruction of the South. Now, when the word is used in its most derogatory sense at the time, the user would mean that the Northerner was moving there to profit on the Reconstruction South, to corrupt Southern governments, to take advantage of the Southern defeat in order to earn money and then leave, or to achieve some kind of power over the people of the South, right? So it's sort of like it's a political slur. That was not necessarily the case, right? Many of the Northerners who moved to the South have grand ideals for what the South could be, and they want to assist the process of emancipation and freedom, and they come under attack for that. Another term you're going to see is scalawag. Scalawag is S-C-A-L-A-W-A-G. And a scalawag is a Southerner, a native-born Southerner, who helps Northerners reconstruct the South. Essentially, a Southern ally of the Republican Party during Reconstruction. So if you see those terms, that's what they mean. They're both political slurs hurled by primarily by Southerners who opposed the policies of Reconstruction, white Southerners, obviously, but in some cases also hurled by Northerners who are growing weary of this and think the South should just be left alone. And that's going to be increasingly common in the 1870s. Okay, this is a long lecture. Thanks for hanging in there. I'll look forward to talking about Reconstruction with you all soon.